Nice to meet you. Everybody, every person, I was gonna say this first of all, like more and more people are coming. When we only had one person on the Zoom, I was gonna tell a story. So I'll tell the story anyways. So there was the rabbi had a Chabad house, and he did a Hanukkah menorah lighting, and he advertised it, and he did everything possible to get people to come, and he made this beautiful event, and him and his wife are waiting for everyone to come, and in the end, only one person shows up. So he was so disappointed. He was so disappointed that one person came, and he talked to this person that came, but kind of with this little bit of like feeling like he wasted his time. So he wrote a letter to the Lubavitch Rebbe, lamenting the fact that he did all this work and only one person came. It was a total failure. The event was a total failure. So the Rebbe wrote back to him, "How dare you say it was a total failure? The entire purpose that you were there was to speak to this one person." So we have to recognize in everything that we're doing that every person is the difference. Every person counts. Every person is an entire world. And we see that we're coming to Rosh Hashanah, that we see that God Almighty looks at every person. Really, Rosh Hashanah, well, for those that don't have a background, Rosh Hashanah is often referred to as the Jewish New Year. You'll see it in your calendar as the Jewish New Year. But the truth of the matter is that it's only Jewish because the Jewish people have been preserving it for the sake of humanity for all these thousands of years, meaning to say that it's really the new year of every single human being. And it commemorates the creation of the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve. Him and his wife were created on Rosh Hashanah, and they were created B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God Almighty. And Rabbi Akiva says that it was a great belovedness that man was created in God Almighty's divine image. And it's an even greater, Achiba Yasira, even greater belovedness, that it's made known to him. That a human being knows that he is created in God Almighty's divine image. And actually, the first thing that Adam did on Rosh Hashanah of the very first moment that he existed, let's see, I'm going to take, if I could, I can mute. He went back, second, okay, everyone's muted now. So the first thing he did is said, L'chuna ranana. If you look in Psalms, the first thing he did is proclaim, he's called to all of creation, let us go and praise and proclaim God Almighty. That's the first thing. A human being is naturally inclined to praise his creator. It doesn't require really any training. What training did he have? He didn't know anything. He didn't go to a school anywhere. He didn't have any chinuch, dedication to the service of God Almighty. He merely opened his eyes, and it was absolutely obvious that there's a creator and who the creator is, and that it's necessary to call upon all of the creation to praise the creator. So what that tells us is how accessible a relationship with God Almighty is. And the work that we have to do in life is not really about finding God. We just have to work to prevent any outside influences or inside influences from dissuading us from a relationship with God Almighty. All the distractions and the pressures and what people have to say and all these kind of things, that's what takes us away. But in reality, we have no obstacles whatsoever to knowing about God Almighty. And that's what Rosh Hashanah comes to teach us. Now, I want to share with you a little bit of the machzor. For maybe many of you have looked inside a machzor, which is a prayer book that especially for Rosh Hashanah. But the interesting thing is, the machzor for Rosh Hashanah. Let me see. I'm going to share the screen over here, and don't worry about seeing the size of the print, because I'm not doing this to give you a class on the machzor, which could be itself and a beautiful experience. But the centrality of the prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are all about the change in the world, that the nations of the world, every single human being is going to come to recognize that they have a creator, that God Almighty is lovingly creating every single human being in his image, but it's loving and intentional creation, recreation every single instant. And if you go through the prayers over here, you'll see that we're praying. What are we getting in the synagogue to pray? We want that God Almighty should be known in the world, that everything that he created, we can see over here in this paragraph here, is talking about every single creation should know, and every person should know and prostrate themselves before you. And it says, it quotes over here from Tzefania, that they're all going to make a one unit to serve God Almighty. Now, this is not a new world order and not a one world government, God forbid. It means that every human being standing on his own 2 feet as an individual will come to recognize God Almighty and will choose to work cooperatively with other human beings around him to be able to serve God Almighty. It's not a Mashiach, the redemption is not about a top-down idea. It's actually completely a bottom-up experience. That every single human being is going to come to recognize God Almighty and then choose to realize that the God Almighty's vision is that there is people working together. We know that everything God Almighty created, he created human beings with the need that we need each other to be able to thrive and to be abundant, for there to be abundance. So the same thing is spiritually. It's not just that physically we need a shoemaker and a guy who has the cows, and we need the guy who has the wheat, and we put all the pieces together and we need to work together. But spiritually, there has to be a joint effort. And that's what the prophets talked about, and that's what God Almighty foresees, and that's what we have to see also. So Rosh Hashanah is a time when we are praying for this. And if we go through the verses, we don't have time tonight, but another time we can go through the verses in the Musaf prayer, which is the prayer that we say after and in conjunction with blowing the shofar. Talks about 3 sections. The 3 main sections there are about Malchus, God Almighty's kingship, Zichronos, God Almighty's remembrance, and about shofars, about the shofar and the shofar, what does the shofar do? And if you pay attention to those verses, you'll see the centrality of the concept and the prayer that the knowledge of God Almighty will reach every single human being. And in fact, it says about the shofar, the Rambam, Maimonides writes, that the purpose of the shofar is to awaken a man from his slumber to the service of God Almighty. And if you go through the halachas of tshuva, you'll see that the Rambam, of returning to God Almighty, you see that the Rambam clearly writes that this applies to every single human being. Every single human being is called upon to return to God Almighty. And he writes in the halachas of Shemitah and Yovel about the 7th year and the 50th year, the Jubilee year, that at the end, the very, very beautiful, moving words that every single human being can take upon himself to set aside all the calculations that the regular men calculate and instead dedicate himself to the service of God Almighty and become holy of holies and live on the level of the tribe of Levi. This is what the Rambam says. Every human being has this opportunity. And we know, of course, that the concept of being a Chasidei Umas Eilam, of being one of the pious among the nations, is, because it says in the Talmud, it says that a non-Jew who learns Torah is considered like the Kohen Gadol. And the Rambam writes that, brings down what the Torah says, that any non-Jew who takes upon himself to fulfill the commandments that apply to every single human being because they were commanded on Mount Sinai by God Almighty himself through Moses, our teacher, that person is called a Chasidei Umas Eilam. We don't use the term is not Ben Noach. It's not, every human being by birth is a child of Noach. But the special role that a human being, every Ben Noach, could take on is to be a Chasidei Umas Eilam, where he's doing it because God commanded it, not because it makes sense, but because God commanded it. And the Rambam says he has is guaranteed as the portion of the world to come. So we see that every human being clearly has a portion in the physical world in God Almighty's abundance, and has a portion in the spiritual eternity that is promised to every single righteous human being. So this is what Rosh Hashanah is about. Rosh Hashanah is everyone taking the time to recognize this, and the urgency is that every human being has to know that Rosh Hashanah is their new year, and it's their day of judgment. And I could post later if you'd like, or if you wanted me to distribute by email, I could send you a copy of a Sikha from the Lubavitcher Rebbe where he urges this, that it's absolutely urgent. Every human being has to know. And what we really have to move from is each person is, on their spiritual journey. Some people take 10 years, 20 years, 50 years to come sort things out, leave what they were used to, come to realize that there's God Almighty has a gift for every single human being to have a direct personal connection with Him, with no intermediaries. But now we have to move into the time is urgent. The time is urgent. We have the Rebbe is saying that we have to reach every human being and let them know. We can't just wait till a person comes in and starts asking questions. It's now essential for every Jew and every non-Jew to realize that any person who doesn't know that what Rosh Hashanah is simply unaware of the reality. And we don't have the luxury of saying, oh, well, people 100 years ago, they seem to have, an understanding of the 10 Commandments. So that's, they don't kill each other. We're well past any residual benefit. We still have, thank God, some residual benefit, but the residual effect of the Torah teachings through Moses, our teacher, are quickly wearing off humanity. And we could see what's happening around us. So we have an urgency to go and bring this message to people for their sake and also for our sake, because our prosperity as a spiritual prosperity and physical prosperity, our spiritual safety and physical safety is dependent only on God Almighty. But it is only, it's successful, the possibility of success is enhanced when the people around us are also striving for spiritual prosperity and for physical prosperity. And when people are fearful, when they forget about God, then we see that there is just chaos, true chaos. So we have a responsibility. We have responsibility for this, every human being in the world. We have responsibility for every human being in the United States of America. And when we see that things are going downhill, it's not for us to say, it's that politician who did it. It's that person in Chicago, that the way they run the city. That's all totally a waste of time. The only person that has responsibility is me. And hopefully you'll realize that you have the same responsibility, because the reason that those kids are doing what they're doing in Chicago or anywhere else in the country, or those people, that there's 70 million abortions in the world, is because we did not get to them the message. And it's our responsibility. We cannot say it's anyone else's responsibility. And God Almighty sees it that way. And he lovingly awaits for us to go and do what Abraham, our father, undertook, which is to not just rely on people coming to him, but he undertook to, with great, intense self-sacrifice, to joyfully and lovingly spread the message to every single human being. I wanted to address, I'm going to speak for just a few more minutes, and then I'm going to take questions. If anyone has questions, hopefully you do. And I'm going to take the questions while I'm actually, my son in his school has a, orientation night for the parents tonight. So my wife and I are going to be driving there from about 7:30 on, and I'll take the questions while we're driving. But before that, I wanted to just address something that I've heard and known about and hear the cry of people talking about loneliness in this journey of being someone that recognizes, coming from a non-Jewish background, recognizes God Almighty, recognizes the truth of the message that's given by God Almighty through Moses, our teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu, and the loneliness that's felt when a person is kind of caught where they don't feel that there's a place to hold them. They don't feel other people around them. And this can be it's obviously very, very difficult. And for them, conversion is not required. It's not necessary. It might not even be appropriate. And they have a mission in the world as Chassidim Umas Elam. A tremendously essential mission in the world is Chassidim Umas Elam. But it's still lonely. And what I was thinking about this is we obviously have to address that. We have to build community. We have to put the energy into that every person is going to know that God Almighty is with them, number one, so that they don't have to be lonely from that perspective, but also provide the energy and the intention to being able to help people build communities. So this now becomes something that is going to go from people kind of, checking in and struggling, but rather it should be people come and they see that there is community. That's absolutely essential. It's clearly what God Almighty wants. Everything in that Judaism includes every human being. Some have to do 613 commandments. Some have the 7 commandments, which are really 30 according to the Talmud in Chulin, and it has hundreds and hundreds of details. So most of the 613 commandments are actually incorporated in the 7, and the 7 actually are the foundation of the 613. And the 10 commandments have 620 letters, which include the 613 commandments and the 7 commandments. So it's all part of one unified whole. So God Almighty wants that there should be community. Everything he has is about community. And it says, obviously, in the prophet Isaiah, that when Mashiach is going to come, all the nations of the world are going to come up to the house of prayer. My house of prayer, God Almighty calls it, for all the nations. It's going to be tremendous, tremendous, beautiful experience of having every human being come together with one effort together to serve God Almighty. But in the meantime, we're kind of in that in-between period. So I was thinking about what does this possibly mean? And the Torah teaches us that every situation we find ourselves in, we have to see that God Almighty put us here for us, that with the pain and with the tears, there is a reason. And why do the people who are the first to see things, why do they have to suffer the most for the loneliness? The guy who's the last guy who's going to, or the last family is going to recognize God Almighty, when he recognizes it, he's going to be welcomed with open arms. Everyone's going to be like, we're so happy you're here. Everyone's going to be so enthusiastic. He's going to come in, everything's going to be ready. However the congregation prayer is going to work, and the going to the temple and the holy temple in Jerusalem, it's all going to be fantastic. He won't have even the slightest, blip of uncertainty. But so why does the person who's the first have to suffer the most? So I want to suggest the following answer. That the reason that you and people in your situation are experiencing loneliness is because God Almighty wants from you something that is a exceptional ability to be leaders and to be able to experience and tolerate the loneliness. I don't mean tolerate it in terms of excusing it and that it's okay and it should be this way. I mean tolerate it as in able to understand and develop the sense of certainty that God Almighty is with you, even if you feel like you're the only human being in the world. That says about Avram Avinu, Abraham our father, that he was one man on one side of the world and the rest of the world was on the other side. Literally, there was nobody with him, because even though he learned from the great Torah sages, Shem ve'Aver, who were the children of Noach and grandchildren of Noach, nevertheless, he was the only one that was so burning with fire that he was going out of his own house and he was going and finding people, and he was really bringing this to God Almighty's ultimate intention. So he was really on one side of the world and everyone else was on the other side. But in addition, I want to suggest that we've come to a time where to truly, truly have a relationship with God Almighty, we have to be willing to go it alone. Because it says that when Mashiach is going to come, and the times before Mashiach is going to come, it's emes nederes. The truth is going to be very, very hard to find. It's not going to be with organizations. It's not going to be with big groups. It's going to be, each person is going to be searching, and each person is going to find someone to, God willing, to guide them, is going to find God Almighty's divine message for them. But it requires a strong spiritual compass and a strong spiritual backbone. Because if this was a group thing, you would say, wouldn't it be better if you could be part of a group and like a whole congregation of people, of non-Jewish people, would just all suddenly swimmingly decide that they're all going to accept the truth of the Torah and become Chassidic Umas Elam. And that would be beautiful. And it's going to happen, and God willing, it should happen. But the problem is, as long as your choices are guided by or shaped by the sense of belonging and the sense of going with the flow, then it's very, very easy for Amalek, who spends the national energy of Amalek is spreading doubt, confusing, spreading despair, demoralizing people. It's very easy for them to come in and find, oh, there's a whole congregation of 100 people, get into one person and just twist the message a little bit. Like there have been congregations that became connected to the Torah, and then their message was twisted a little bit to tell the people who were part of it, you could serve God Almighty, but don't spread the message to any other non-Jews. Well, that's a falsehood. But people who are following somebody else, or their group membership is their key experience, they just go along with that, because they're going to challenge that. They're going to give up their group membership to now go be a loner. They're going to leave this leader who they followed out of their previous practices, and now he says don't tell anyone else about it, and then they're going to be like leaving that. They don't even know where to go. So I want to suggest that the loneliness you're experiencing is the incredible spiritual backbone of being able to do what's right, even if you're the only person. And we have to see that throughout the Torah, every person who did the right thing when called upon it to do it was a person who did it when everyone else was not with him. Literally. Everyone else was not with him. You look at Mordechai, my father, Olav Shalom, would always say to me with Purim time, my birthday's on Purim, the book of Esther, Purim, and he would always say to me, do you notice that the Megillah tells us that Mordechai, the righteous one, did not bow to Haman and did not bow? Well, of course it says that. It says in the Megillah. It says it in the book of Esther. He didn't bow. So my father said, yes, that's the lesson. It tells us that he didn't bow because everyone else was bowing. So you have to know that you have to be willing not to bow when everyone else is bowing. And not only was he not bowing and everyone else is bowing, but they accused him of being the start of the genocide, because the other rabbi said to him, if only you bowed like everyone else, Haman would not have got upset and tried to eliminate the Jewish people. And then the next after the Jews were the rest of the Persian people on the Amalek's list. But you have to be willing to be the only one. So God Almighty is putting each one of you through a situation where you feel like you're the only one, because that's a gift to be able to develop your own spiritual backbone, so that even when you come to work in conjunction with other people, you are able to maintain your own integrity, maintain your own principles, call out when you think things are veering from what the Torah says, not be afraid to return to the loneliness. You'll never compromise because you know that you've been through the loneliness. You'll never compromise if someone comes and suggests, well, let's water this down. Let's not talk about this. Let's adopt some socialist, Marxist, Enlightenment philosophy that it seems like everyone else is adopting. You're going to be like, no. But the difference between you and the other people who are going to struggle, it's going to be a greater struggle for those people that want to belong. Now, we all want to belong, and we do belong. But we belong to God Almighty, and God Almighty wants us to work together with other people who have the same level of integrity as us, the same spiritual backbone, and the same spiritual compass. And so I know that doesn't take care of the feeling of loneliness for you, but I want to suggest that you consider what I'm suggesting, that this is preparing each of you and your families and your children to be the real examples for humanity, and have the real ability to bring us through to the redemption, to the Geula, is going to be by people like that, like you, who are willing truly to be the only ones. And only afterwards do you find out, after you're willing to be the only ones, then you find out there's someone here who turns out feels the same way and is doing the same things, and then someone there. And then you realize, oh no, amazing. Not only are there a few people who are also doing the same thing, but actually we're going to discover that all 8 billion people actually really, really want the same thing. And they're just stuck mostly in their not being willing to give up their sense of belonging to go it, so to speak, go it alone with God Almighty, walk with God Almighty, and be truly have that spiritual compass and spiritual backbone. Well, we're going to show them the example, and we're going to encourage them one by one to uplift them to be able to do this. So when you're in Rosh Hashanah and you're thinking to yourself, why aren't you in a synagogue somewhere, and why aren't you have a whole group of people together? And that would be nice, and it's so important to have kids to play with, and it's all these things are essential, and God Almighty wants that, and it's coming. But right now, God Almighty put you exactly where you are for this purpose, to be able to identify the truth and stick to the truth and be in loving service of God Almighty, your creator, who loves you and is creating you at every single instant, and gather your children together and then be able to take that energy of certainty and commitment to God Almighty and bring that message to the entire world, which is the job of every single human being. So with that, I'm going to pause for a minute. And if you are, I'm going to switch to my cell phone. And I hope that you have questions. I'm not only available now, I'd like to let you know, you could email me at info@rabbismith.org. I have a whole website and many, many classes teaching practical Torah learning for non-Jews. We learned Rabbi Yonash Steif. He was the chief rabbi of Budapest before the war. He wrote an entire volume as a guide for non-Jews. It's 528 pages plus of guidance going through every one of the principles of Torah and every one of the mitzvahs, commandments between man and his fellow, and all the commandments, and showing how it relates to the non-Jews. We do that every Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. We have a class on Wednesday nights at 8 o'clock. This is all Eastern time in prayer. On prayer, we're going through the prayer book, the Siddur, and I've marked up every page and every line in the Siddur as to what is meant for a non-Jew to say, what they is recommended to say, what is not relevant to say, and explaining every one of the prayers. And God willing, we'll be able to print this. And then Thursday morning, I have a learning on 10 o'clock on Emunah, faith in action. And then Thursday night with Rabbi Chirik, we do the Gate of Oneness, which is the teachings of the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. And we also talk about different topics. Shabbos afternoon, I have what I call Yeshiva Shem Ve'ever in my house. So it's not recorded, it's not videoed, but we learn Shari Yichud V'Amunah, the second section of Tanya, from the Alter Rebbe, from the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, which is the Lubavitcher Rebbe said is meant for every single non-Jew to learn. And once I started to teach that with the understanding, then I started to see how the Alter Rebbe wrote it to literally uplift every single human being to the 12 chapters to come to the complete clarity that there is nothing besides God Almighty. You don't have to spend, once you learn this, you don't have to spend time with anyone talking about refuting any false gods, because this is so clear, and how he goes through and lovingly shows us how he brings us really to the feeling of knowing that we are lovingly and caringly being recreated by God Almighty at every single instant. And that message of love is essential for every single human being, that whatever love that they've mistakenly attributed to any other forces or ideas and so forth, the love is real, but it was really coming from God Almighty himself all along, and it's available to every human being. They're not going to skip a beat in terms of the love by dropping falsehoods and idolatries, and instead relating and interacting directly with the one who's lovingly giving them breath and their soul and every instant of existence. So we have much stuff going on, Baruch Hashem, and as I mentioned to earlier, I introduced my daughter. We're starting now an after-school program here in northern New Jersey for children after school to come for an hour and a half a day. My she just finished her second year of seminary. She's committing her year to do this, and she also, based on discussion with people here, the Longworths and so forth, and I know Mrs. Houston and others, we just got to meet tonight, and there's so much that needs to be done, and there's such an urgency of being able to make. The Torah was given on Mount Sinai by God Almighty to the Jewish people to make sure that the message that applies to every single human being, gets to every single human being. Torah was given in the Talmud, in the Tractate of Shabbos, says that the Torah was delivered in 70 languages simultaneously. God Almighty's word was spoken and split up into 70 languages, and Moses was instructed by God Almighty to write the Torah in 70 languages, and it was done on multiple occasions. That every single human being should know what the Torah says. This is the guidebook for every single human being, and it's really infinite. So we have the merit to get every human being on, to help them on their journey of coming to see this, and really bring the opportunity to every human being. And this is, the time is now. Time is now. No one wants to wait anymore, and we're here to be of service to you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi.